Welcome back to another segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons. Today I'm taking up more of your questions in a segment of Ask Judy. This question is from S Side 8, hope that's right. When certain regular cast members are not on an episode, are they still paid? How does that work? For the Walton family, we were all basically contracted for the entire season, so every episode. And to my understanding, everybody in the sort of family cast were all paid by the episode. So it was a negotiated amount, like for each episode, regardless of how much work you did in an episode. So sometimes you might have a lot of work, sometimes you might have one or two scenes. So things like that, it worked that way. Then for other recurring characters, I think it was a mix of how they were paid. And I'm going to get into that in a minute because somebody had a sort of follow-up question. Continuing on about how the whole pay scale and things like that worked. From Bill Grandone, he said, I was wondering about your time on the sets and how you were paid. I know you were paid by the episodes and you were on, and I think that you were in almost all, but were you paid in terms of the time you actually spent on set, or was payment a flat fee per episode? Yes, so it was per episode, so it didn't matter how much time you spent. And if an actor is being paid just like a day rate or like union scale, then if you run into overtime, they have to pay you whatever that overtime is. I think it starts going into time and a half and then double time. But when you are contracted per episode, then you don't get overtime or meal penalties or things like that. It's considered you're already being paid more than scale, so it's just kind of included. So it didn't matter what time you were there. Now, I did say I was going to touch on non-family members. So for characters, and I think this applied to characters like Ike Godsey and Corabath, and I recently spoke with Leslie Winston, and who played Ben's wife, Cindy. So with characters like that, Leslie said she was guaranteed a certain number of episodes per season. So let's say she was guaranteed 10 out of 22 or 10 out of 24. So she would get paid guaranteed whatever her rate was per episode for 10 episodes. If she did 12, then for those other additional 2 episodes, she would get paid that same per episode rate for each subsequent episode they did. So I think sometimes producers didn't want to over guarantee, because if for some reason they didn't use the character that many times, then they'd be contractually obligated to still pay the actor for episodes they weren't in. So I think they sort of underestimated, and then with the agreement that if there were subsequent episodes, that they would get the same per episode rate. So that worked. And then guest stars, I think that was negotiable. There was typically a top of show amount. Most shows had their, our guest stars are paid up to X amount. And they might, if they didn't have a lot of credentials, they might be negotiated down to a lesser rate. Sometimes if someone only had a day, they'd just be paid a day rate or a couple days. There's a point where if you have a certain number of days, it becomes more cost effective to just pay an episode rate. Go, okay, we're going to pay you for the episode, as opposed to, because if you have a higher day rate, then it might add up and they might end up having to pay the person more. So that's sort of how it worked, like who was on a guarantee and who was on a day rate, who was on a per season rate. It varied, I'm sure, depending on how involved each recurring character was. I know when I was a recurring character on Beggars and Choosers up in Canada, I kind of had a day rate. And so whenever I was called for my availability, it would be sort of like, well, this is Judy's day rate. And so however many days I was working, my agent would try to get me that guarantee. So it kind of worked like that, and I expect it's the same way here. Then, Bill, you also asked, were you paid in terms of the time you actually spent on set, or was payment a flat fee per episode? Yes. And in regard to time on set, if your scenes were finished, say, at sometime before noon, could you leave and go home, or elsewhere? I know you went to school on the premises, but otherwise were you required to stay until shooting was over? No. We were given a call time, and that was based on when within the day your first scene would be. So if you were in the first scene, obviously you'd be called first thing for hair and makeup. If you didn't have a scene till 3/4 of the way through the day, you might be called just before lunch or just after lunch to make sure that you were hair, makeup ready and all of that by the time they got to your scene in case they were going fast. So once you were there, you had to hang around until your scenes were finished. And then once you were done, someone would give you an okay. You'd sign out with the assistant director, but you couldn't just leave until they said you were dismissed for the day. But you did not have to hang around if you were done. Yes, when we were in school, if we had not completed our required 3 hours for the day, then we would go to school until we completed 3 hours. Or if it was a pretty short day, we still wouldn't be there more than 8 hours when we were under 18. So if it had been a long day, you might not do extra school time. But if it was a day where, say, you didn't even work, you'd go in, you'd do 3 hours of school, you'd go. Or you'd go in and you'd do 4 hours of school to bank school time so that on a day when you were working a lot and you simply could not squeeze in that 3 hours of school time, you had extra time that you had banked to kind of cumulatively make that school time that was required. Donna Williams asked, she said that it was wonderful to see the surprise guests that you interview. I know that you interviewed John, in which he shared about his music on the show. Would you be able to do a program about the different styles of music on the Waltons? Maybe even explain how music was matched up with segments that were shot. Thing with the music is it always happened away from the set. It happened up in the music department, and typically after the show was finished. So that would be part of post-production when they were doing the editing and the sound and the composing for the episode. So I have no idea how those choices were made because I was never part of that. I never saw it. In some projects that I've worked on, some independent things that I've directed or then sometimes I've had a little more understanding of what's gone on. When I did my little short film, Space Limbo, which some of you may have seen, it's on my YouTube channel, a little sort of COVID project I did. I hired the composer, and in that case, I went through the show with him after. It's like a little 20-minute short film. And I would talk with him about my concept for it. I might give him some samples of music just for feel. It's like, oh, it's a little bit like this or a little bit like that. And just talk about the feel of different scenes and what I was interested in. And then he would, compose something. He'd send it to me and I'd give a listen to it. And I might say, oh, yeah, that's great. I love that. Or could it be a little more of this or add this or change this? So I would have input in it from that standpoint until I felt that it really properly fit the film. So I imagine that's sort of the same thing that they did on the Waltons. The composer would know the style of the show. And I imagine at that point, I don't know how much the director got involved in that. It may have been more just the producers relative to the final edit, but I'm sure they had tremendous confidence in our composer, in Sandy Courage, who did a lot of the seasons of the Waltons. I'm sure that they just kind of trusted him to do it, and maybe there was an occasional note, or if he had questions, I'm sure he asked. But I'm speculating on that, so if I'm way off, I apologize. But that's kind of my understanding of how it works. Thank you for joining me for this segment of Ask Judy. I will be back with more behind the scenes of the Waltons, more Ask Judy, and more special guests. Thanks for watching.